All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanagh here, and I'm very pleased to have a real pioneer in the industry with us today. Michel Tricot is with us. He's the founder and CEO of a company called Airbyte, and they are doing some really interesting work in the data integration space. And today we're going to talk about reverse ETL. So for those who don't know, ETL, extract, transform, load. This is the bread and butter of data ingest, basically pulling data from one system, extracting, transforming it into a schema that will fit into the target system. For example, like a data warehouse, that's the usual path, is to go from an operational system into a data warehouse so you can then analyze the data. And what we're going to talk about today is reverse ETL, so hydrating all those other business applications with the data from the warehouse. Really important stuff, really important to have the latest customer information, the latest product information, the latest clickstream information, whatever it is that you're trying to fuel your business with. You don't want the warehouse to just be the domain of analysts to offline look at what's happening and make some suggestions. No, you're using the warehouse to get that deterministic view of your business, to cleanse the data, to purify the data, maybe to enrich the data, and then you want to send it back out to all the systems that can use that, customer-facing systems, supplier systems, partner systems, whatever the case may be. That is the domain of reverse ETL. And Michel, I'll throw it over to you to kind of comment on this and where you folks are going at Airbyte. But I would imagine that it's not just the same as ETL, right? When you're going the other way, there are different formats you need to keep in mind. There are different frequencies. The impedance mismatch comes into play. Lots of factors come into play. What do you think about reverse ETL and how big a deal is it for you going into the next year?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we always look at the data space in like two different pieces. One which is very analytics, the other one which is operational. And reverse
Right.
ETL is in this operational space. Now, when we think about it, for us, what we're looking at is very much at the infrastructure level, which is what you're doing is you're creating roads for data. You're moving data across different systems. And the requirements that you have with analytics versus reverse ETL are very different. As you mentioned, like latency, in general, you want your data to be fresh as fast as possible in your downstream systems. You also have a lot more requirements around how many times can you deliver that data? You know, when you push data into a data warehouse, you always have this ability to deduplicate your data. You have basically time to make sure that the data you're working with is correct and you can treat it, you can make sure it's clean. When you push it into an operational system, it's going to be used right away by either a human or it's going to be used right away by an automation. And the level of guarantee has to be extremely, extremely strong. So the way you think about these two sides of data movements is very different. Also, when you miss a piece of data on analytics, depending on what kind of analytics you're running, it can be okay. Like you might be missing a few cents if you're doing your like counting how many orders you get. If you're missing data on an operational system, you might just be messing up your automation. So downstream, you will break a lot of systems. So there is a lot of guarantees that you need to provide that are very different from the analytics space. And that's what after releasing Airbyte 1.0, which was extremely focused on this analytics use case, putting that platform and putting it into the state of how do we actually get more streaming system or real-time system, like what we call dead letter queue system, where maybe the downstream system is not working right now. So you need to make sure that you don't lose anything. Like all these things are guarantees that a system needs to have to make reverse ETL possible.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, operational systems, that's what's running the business. So you have to be very, very careful about how you touch those systems, how you impact those systems, at what point in time during the day do you perform this reverse ETL? Do you want to set it up on a regular pattern? I mean, the bottom line is you have to be very, very careful with any operational system, because if you bring it down, you're losing business, you're losing customers. It's a very, very bad situation. Whereas to your point, if it falters going into the warehouse, not as big of a deal. Going back, mission critical. You get it absolutely correct and really monitor that and know and pay attention with observability to make sure it's working properly and you're not messing up your operational systems, right?
Yeah, correct. And like a very simple example, if people want to really understand how bad it could be, just imagine that you're connecting to a downstream system that is sending emails or SMS to users. If by any chance you feed the wrong data or you tag the wrong segment to the user you're trying to reach, suddenly you're going to be sending tons of emails to the wrong people. Or you might just be telling people that, hey, your usage of the product is going down when maybe it's going up. And you're going to be confusing people. It's going to have an impact on your product, on your brand. And that's the type of impact you can have on your business. Or it could just be that you're feeding the wrong data into Salesforce, and suddenly your sales force is just, okay, I'm not saying the right thing to my customer. I don't have the right understanding of the person in front of me. And that will lead to slower sales cycle, or maybe just not making the deal at all. So that's really the level of impact you can have. And since we're talking about data, ever since the beginning, there was a lot of talk also a few years ago about reverse ETL, and a lot of people went into reverse ETL without really having the proper foundation and the proper checks and balances on what does my source data look like. And so they went directly to the step of, oh, let's push data into operational system. But if you don't have that rigor on making sure that your data is clean, that you have that monitoring on top of that, you might not see it right now, but at some point, it will hit you in the face really, really hard, because that data is going to go directly to your customer and you're going to do something wrong with it.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes
So
that makes a lot of sense. And would you say that the delicacy of the situation is such that we haven't seen all that much reverse ETL yet? Because let's face it, operational people, they're like, don't touch it, man. Don't mess with my system. Like it's working. I don't want it to not work. And then the other point you made is automation, understanding the strategic lineage of automation processes, what will get automated when. You need to be very careful about when you start throwing that data into a process, because if you get it at the wrong point in time, to your point, you can automate something that is very unpleasant and causes a tremendous amount of damage. Error propagation, as they call it, right?
yeah, correct. When it's a human that is at the other end, in general, you're operating at the latency of a human being, meaning maybe it's an hour, maybe it's a day, that works. Yes, well, the moment you start touching automation, that's when everything goes really fast. And that's the moment when one little grain of salt in your engine can just have really terrifying consequences. For us, really, our entrance into reverse ETL, actually. So internally, we sometimes use the word reverse ETL, or we use the word publish interchangeably, because what we're doing is we're basically publishing production data into a system. That's how we like to call it internally. Our first real use case for it was when we started to go more for the pushing data into AI system, because what we were the company we were working with are building this RAG application, which is how do I enrich my prompt with real data from the customer rather than just what it was trained on. And very, very quickly, they asked us, how can I make sure that the data that I'm feeding into my vector database is always up to date? How do I make sure that when a ticket is being submitted in Zendesk or updated in Zendesk, it makes its way into the vector database as fast as possible? So here we're not into a warehousing space anymore, because these applications are used by humans on the field, on the support team, to have access to the most recent information and to make decisions based on that. And so for us, we also see that as a type of reverse ETL use case. Reverse ETL, yeah, I like to use operational use case because I think it's a bigger family than just saying reverse ETL, but the idea is the same. It's just you're touching an operational system that has automation and business decision being made. And that was very much our first use case of how can we get that data streamlined faster, but also how do we
Right.
make sure that we have checks and balances to make sure that this data is correct, that this data
Right.
has been properly um, embedded, and so that it can be like found by the AI application that's built on top of it.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up RAG, retrieval augmented generation. It really seems to be the go-to solution for being able to leverage Gen AI in a responsible way. And it seems to me that RAG and Gen AI in general is such a powerful force that it's going to require the same kind of refactoring and rethinking that was required with Kubernetes. Because when Kubernetes came out, of course, Docker first, then Kubernetes, you saw all these software companies refactoring their stack to run in containers. And I think that this transformation we're witnessing right now is of that caliber. It is that big of a deal. So do you agree that RAG, and whether you use RAG or fine tuning or a combination of those two, that's where the focus is going to be for the next few years as we reinvent how these systems operate? Because this is not a small change. What do you think?
It is not a small change. I would make a parallel between what happened with regular SQL databases and document databases.
Hmm.
Like, you go back 15 years ago. I mean, I don't want to minimize what we just, okay. 15
Yeah,
years
no, it's
ago,
good. Yeah,
we suddenly we had like these document databases, and people were saying, this is going to be the database of the future. And
interesting.
everybody started to push more document into document databases. And what happened very fast is that you realize that, well, both have very good at specific use cases. So we
Right.
still have MySQL, we still have Postgres, we still have like MS SQL. Like they still are here because they are extremely good at very specific use cases. Document
Hmm.
databases are here, always super powerful, but they are here for very specific use cases. When I think of RAG, I don't see RAG architecture as a replacement for that, because today an LLM model or RAG cannot count. That's just the
Right.
reality of things. It can, but what it can do though is using this technology gives you access to a set of data that was inaccessible before. And here we're talking about unstructured data. Like, how do you
Right.
make sure that the text that is in your Zendesk ticket, you can do something with it? You cannot count text, but
Right.
now you actually have a way to leverage that in an
That's a
automated way.
quote.
Yeah. Uh, and so that's really for me what is happening is that it is big, not because it replaces the past. It is big because it allows you to touch a piece of data that was extremely expensive to leverage in the past. And we're talking
Yeah.
about like 90% of the data that exists in more than 90% of the data that exists in the world. Like unstructured data is extremely expensive, was extremely expensive to leverage, and now it's
Right.
affordable.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and all the context is in the unstructured data, right? Like I think about so you talk about 15 years ago, I think about the evolution of information systems and in particular data warehousing. So why do we do things a certain way in data warehousing? Well, many of the policies and rules that are leveraged in that world stem from an older time when processors were slow, storage was expensive, pipes were thin. It's a very different world right now. So what we did is we stripped out all the context to get just the signal into the warehouse such that we could crunch the numbers, to your point. But then you had to add the context in back on the other end. And what I see happening with a lot of this Gen AI stuff is we may not need to strip out that much anymore. We may be able to synthesize our worldview here using Gen AI trained on your enterprise unstructured data and or leveraged through a RAG model in conjunction with your deterministic data from the data warehouse. Now the analyst can get a very rich view of what's happening in context, and that's incredibly powerful for business. What do you think?
Yeah, for me, it's really just this difference between quantitative information and qualitative information.
Right,
Quantitative
right,
information, it's numbers. You can automate. But when you have a number, you don't have the context. When you want to do qualitative analysis or qualitative processing, then in general, what happens is you have a smaller subset of data. You hope that it has been sampled the right way, like it can be survey data, it can be ticket data. And you're looking at it almost like one by one to get a sense of, oh, what was discussed, what was that customer actually saying when they were saying that specific things. You don't capture that with numbers. But
Right.
now what we've done is basically we can automate qualitative qualitative data, like information extraction. And that is, yeah, that is extremely powerful. But I like to look at these two as quantitative was automated, qualitative was manual, and now we're in a world where qualitative analysis becomes like it's doable at scale.
Right.
So very much in line with what you said, yeah.
Right. Well, and there's also this concept of hybrid search. We got a couple minutes left in this segment here. I think that that people are going to get savvier and savvier about leveraging hybrid search, where you bring in the deterministic value from your data warehouse, from your trusted systems, but then you bring in all this rich context using the LLM and your RAG model. And again, that gives you a much more complete view in the moment. And this is the thing, like with you, there's always been ad hoc queries of people just trying to understand something, but now you can have enriched ad hoc queries that give you deep analysis and qualitative information about what's happening in your business. That is a very big deal. That's much, much better and more valuable to the business than what we had 5 years ago. What do you think? One
Yeah.
minute.
And you see that today already in support. Basically, they can now have access to this type of information. Like I'm taking support because this is a place where you want to do things at scale, as fast as possible, because it is one, you want to be able to delight your customer as fast as possible. You want to really extract this product information from them. So yes, this is what we're seeing today on the field, where now a support team can have access to cases, like synthesized cases across all their users, but not in a like very how would you say that, like simple way. It's not, the data is synthesized. They know what has happened across a bunch of customers. Like the summary is high
Right.
quality, and they can really
Right.
be extremely efficient at helping customers. It's just extremely
Right.
impressive. I love to see that.
Yeah, that's an excellent example, and we're coming up at the end of the first segment here. But that is an excellent use case because it's they're internally focused. In other words, the customer service rep is getting the information, and that person can then decide whether or not to use it. So if it's wonky, if it's a hallucination of some kind, they know not to do that. But it's very, very good at that kind of thing. Folks, don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio talking to Michel Tricot. He is the founder and CEO of a company called Airbyte that is taking a bite out of the data integration market, doing some pretty cool stuff out there. And you're focused on 2.0 right now. And we talked about reverse ETL, or hydrating operational systems is one way that I like to put it. So you pull data out of these systems into a data warehouse. It's deterministic. You've cleansed it. You've really focused on getting it right. Now you push it back out at an appropriate cadence in appropriate ways, understanding that you want to be very careful anytime you touch an operational system. So you have to be very careful about that. But then there's this other whole conversation happening around streaming. And I just came back from the Confluent Current conference down in Austin, Texas, and I've been very, very stricken by how interesting this new way of doing things is. But it is a bit of an impedance mismatch. Now, I've heard stories about companies publishing Kafka streams in Vertica or in databases. And it's like, well, you certainly want to understand the history, for example, because you always want to have historical context to your live stream. But the streaming part is very interesting, and it's real time. And what I always loved about it was that any organization can allow any department to subscribe to a topic, to subscribe to a stream, and to now use this real-time information. Where does streaming fit into your Airbyte vision for version 2.0?
Yeah. So the first thing is, often we use streaming and real time together. For me, like
Ah,
streaming is a technology, real time is a business definition. Because we talk to our
interesting.
customers and they say, "Oh, we need real time data," and you say, "Okay, what is real time for you?" It's just,
Right,
well, we don't want data every month. We want data every day. That's real time.
right.
Some other will tell you, like if you're in the gaming industry, real time means milliseconds. So that's why I've generally tried to really focus on streaming when I talk about this topic, because real time is a business definition, not a product definition at that point.
Right. That's a good point.
On the streaming side, It really depends on what your data is used for. Like obviously, streaming serves a lot of different use cases, but it's also very complex systems. Because when you have streaming, if your streaming system goes down, data is lost. And that's that, like, you know that a streaming system that goes down means data is lost. For
Right.
me, thinking about streaming fits a lot more um, in the operational use case than in the analytics use case. Because when you do analytics, in general, it's not an automation that acts behind, it's a human. So at that point, you realize that the latency that you need for your data doesn't have to be millisecond. It can be minutes or 5 minutes. So with Airbyte, the way we've made that compromise for this first part of our journey on analytics was to do what we call micro batches, which is just replicating data down to like a 1 minute interval, which is very close to getting like real-time data for users. Now, when you go into operational system, that is very different because, if you're closing, like just taking an example on support, for example, that we talked about before, like when you close a ticket, you want that information to propagate as fast as possible to all the downstream system because you might be closing it on one system and you want to see that maybe when you're searching on an internal knowledge base that this ticket doesn't show as still open. You want it to be closed because that's like, as human, we want to see an action and a reaction on the other one.
Right.
And you don't want to wait
Right.
for an hour for that thing to be updated. So for me, that's when streaming comes into play. It allows you to reduce that latency. Now, in terms of publishing, I wouldn't say like streaming is the only way to do it. I think people are also publishing like files or tables or databases or things like that as an interface for the rest of their teams. Streaming makes sense when you start really doing automation, when it's not human making decision downstream, but when it's machines.
Interesting.
That's generally my criteria for thinking about streaming versus batches or micro batches. If you have a
Yeah.
system making decision, then you need to have a streaming system because you will be able to react fast.
Yeah, that
But
makes a lot of sense. Horses for courses, as my old co-host used to say. Understand what is the business need now, which kind of technology will fit to solve for that particular challenge. That makes a lot of sense. And I'd like to ask you one other big question here, which is really a strategic question around data management. And I remember, DM radio is in year 17, so we've been doing this stuff a long, long time. And in the first year of the show, as I was wrapping my head around ETL and batch windows and all these things in the data warehouse, it became very apparent to me that you're going to get more and more requests for data. The batch windows are going to get more and more stressed, basically, to get the information in there. And I would ask people, do you have a strategic view of which data is going where at what time? Reason being, you might be moving the same data 2 or 3 times in a single day in different ETL, different batch processes. With Airbyte, are you able to provide a strategic view to optimize that kind of thing where it's like, okay, we moved customer transaction data and let's say clickstream data over early this morning at 8 a.m. Do we really need to move customer data over in a separate batch window at 9 a.m.? Can you actually see the overall picture of what's moving where and optimize that?
we can see where data is moving. This is for sure. Now, the way you build your topology for data movement depends on your business.
Hmm.
You're looking at, you talked about clickstream data. So, no, actually, let's talk more like the customer data piece. I think the more complex your organization become, the more complex your topology is going to become. And it is like when you have this type of complexity, I think it is okay that your data moves and is duplicated in different systems as long as you know where your source of truth actually is. And it's because you
Interesting.
don't know how each of these teams is going to be consuming that data. Some team might be using that customer data for analytics. Some team might be using that customer data for sending emails, sometimes, or to trigger an emails. And so you realize that the ways they're going to be consuming that data is going to be different. Some of them will need that in a Postgres database. Some of them will need that in a Kafka topic. Some of them will need that in a data warehouse because that's their interface with the data. So for me, it's not so much about being efficient on how the data is moving. It's more about being efficient about where the data is landing to serve organization to leverage that data as efficiently as possible. So it's more about the efficiency of consumption rather than the efficiency of movement.
Ah, that's very interesting. That's very interesting. And, I've always believed that data is the lifeblood of an organization. Your data and where it goes and how it's used, that's your business blueprint. That is a reflection of what your business is all about. So the more an organization focuses on which information sets it has, where they're going, what people are doing with it, that should fuel your business strategy and your optimization plans, right?
Absolutely. And that's when what you're saying before, which is around like how do you track where the data is going, what lineage, what transformation, like having these systems that run on top of it that monitor where data is, how fresh it is, how correct it is, was there any data outage, anything like that, that's when that becomes very important. Like this orchestration of where is the data, how fresh and everything. Like you need to have that, but you should not go in a place where you're trying to minimize how data is moving, because if you minimize it, then you're limiting your use cases. And this is something where
Interesting.
life and blood, you want to have as much blood as possible in your organization flowing,
Right.
because you want people to
Right.
make the decision with the right context or to automate
Right.
system with the right context.
Right. And let's talk about the right blood going through governance, data governance. I'm old enough to remember when data governance was just an aspirational conversation that people would have, and there really was no teeth to it. Are there data governance capabilities baked into Airbyte, or what's your take on how to do data governance and why it matters?
Yeah. So we do a lot of governance on what we call like source access. So,
Hmm.
when you need to pull data from, let's say, Salesforce, not everyone should have access to that data because there might be customer sensitive data, there might be revenue data, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the place where we have a lot of our governance role is who has access to move the Salesforce data into a downstream system. And this is where we have very strong rules, like roles around users, admins who can say which team can have access to which pipe, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the first part of governance. After that, you also have other type of other pieces, governance around like the privacy of data. Sometimes you're pulling data from a production database that has social security number in it. Well, you definitely don't want that data to end in a data warehouse, because in general, the scrutiny that you put on data warehouses might be a little bit lower than what you have on your PCI compliant database. And this is a place where the governance rules that we also put in place is about what data, what specific fields are allowed to move from one system to another. And that's how you continue to give a lot of access to data to people, but at the same time, you're protecting them against themselves. Like, yes, I don't want social security number in my warehouse because I don't know who else or where that report is going to go in the future.
Right. Let me ask you a question about, again, 2.0 and the future and where you see things moving. I lived through the whole Hadoop era, and Hadoop was going to solve all the world's problems. And turns out that MapReduce is just not that agile, and it's only good for certain use cases. So I was out there pretty early saying, "Are you guys sure? 'Cause this seems a little bit kludgy." And then what happens? On just as the elephant is faltering, Snowflake comes along, has this huge IPO, and meanwhile, Databricks is out there plotting away on the engine of Spark, which is basically the foundation of everything that Databricks has built internally. Now, of course, they're buying things. I watched as Ali Ghodsi went and bought Mosaic ML early in the ball game. In fact, I had Naveen Rao on my show something like a week after that transaction went through, one of the biggest billion-dollar deals, fastest deals ever to happen. I thought that was very, very clever because at the time, the other data warehousing folks were cracking jokes about Gen AI. And meanwhile, Ali went out and grabbed himself a very prominent Gen AI company. I think that is the future, this fusion of the two worlds. You have to be careful about how you blend these things and use them for appropriate use cases. But to me, that is the future. Do you think that this Gen AI fused to operational systems, the deterministic systems, is that going to be the future of information management?
One 100%. And it's just because Gen AI today allows you to process a piece of data that was inaccessible before. And people are
That's
going
right.
to realize the power of that, and that will really change their perception. So it is absolutely a fusion. Now, my mental model is always to layer things up and to
Hmm.
always think about like hardware, infrastructure, software, et cetera, et cetera. When we're thinking about data warehouses, when we're thinking about Gen AI, it's really like this layer on top that is powered by the actual data. So
Hmm.
part of the data is going to go in data warehouse, part of the data is going to go in Gen AI. But there is a reason why, I mean, if you look at it, BigQuery very, very fast added ML features in their warehouse. And Snowflake recently released like Cortex. And yeah, Databricks always had that close proximity with ML engineer, with like AI
Right.
type of technology, and not now a lot more into Gen AI. It's just that when you start to be good with your data fundamental and you see the value of it, you want to go further. And further means more data sources, it more advanced processing. And now all these tools are equipping themselves to make sure that they can now tap into this 90% of data that wasn't tapped.
Yeah.
So absolutely, like the
Right.
fusion is happening right now, and
Yeah.
pretty happy to be living in that time.
Well, and you're playing a crucial role of feeding data to these systems, whether to the warehouse or to the operational systems or to the vector databases, to your point earlier. We've got about a minute and a half left here. I throw you my vision of the executive cockpit where executives will have their natural language interface. And meanwhile, there are either data pipelines or Kafka topics coming from all the operational systems into the vector database and your small language model that you've trained, and then you can ask any question you want about anything all day long and then even take actions. What do you think about that executive cockpit idea? How big a deal would that be?
I would love to have that today. Uh, t- that, I think it's just about, it becomes really about your efficiency and your ROI
Mm,
as a person, which is
yeah.
if you can just talk and have this automated and like smart automated answer in a second rather than spending 5 hours talking to people to get that information.
Right.
Like
Right.
the rate at which you can make decision is just
It's
unprecedented.
crazy.
It is
It's
crazy. And
crazy.
so I would love to have that. And we're getting
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
But
I think you
you
hit,
need to
yeah,
have
go ahead.
real-time data. You
Yeah.
need to have like up-to-date data. You need to have like FICE, like low latency, et cetera, to make sure
That's
that
right.
you're not making
Right.
decision out of outdated data.
That's right. That's why you want that metadata with your recency bias baked in. But folks, look this gentleman up online, Michel Tricot of Airbyte, doing amazing things in the data world. You are listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, talking all about modern data pipelines, what they're doing, what's happening in that space, why it matters. And of course, Michel Tricot of Airbyte offered a lot of really interesting perspective on what they're doing and where they're going with these things. And let's face it, folks, there are lots and lots of options in the data integration world these days. I decided to pull up a quick list thanks to our friend Gemini. Yes, I'm a Gemini user. Most people are on ChatGPT. I get that. I'm a Google guy, though, so I use Gemini, thinking I'm just going to be focused on that one platform for various reasons. But yeah, I just got a list of top 10 data integration and data pipeline companies according to them. Informatica, no surprise, they're at the top here. A leader in the space for 15 years at least. They've been doing this stuff for a long, long time. Really good stuff, a whole set of products. Expensive. One of my good friends always jokes that everyone has in Informatica, not everyone uses it. So there's a lot of sales that have been done that aren't being fully leveraged. And some would argue it's a bit long in the tooth. It took them a while to get to data virtualization. They were early with it, But my understanding is there was a lot of pressure from the inside against going that route and against going to data integration in the cloud. Of course, they're doing that these days, but there was pushback for the obvious reason that a lot of companies were paying Informatica a lot of money for Power Center and for the traditional data integration approach. Talend, of course, was the open source data studio, Talend Data Studio, that is now closed. I bought them and pulled the string on the open source data integration studio, which threw a real wrench in the works for lots and lots and lots of companies out there. And I have to say, when that all went down, I was pretty surprised to see that happen. Talent has been an open source pioneer. I mean, in many ways, it was like the Lancelot of open source because it was a huge company, very, very prominent, of course, based in France, and offered a pretty darn good solution written in Java, as I recall. So that's kind of an interesting situation compared to most other data integration platforms that are built in C sharp, C++, something like that. But, yeah, they're still huge, but yeah, the open source version, the free open source version no longer supported. So that caused a real ruffle, if you will, of feathers in the industry. There's also MuleSoft. They specialize in API-led connectivity, of course, part of Salesforce now. Hats off to Mark Benioff for buying a lot of really good companies. He bought Tableau, he bought MuleSoft, he bought Slack for crying out loud. They talked about having millions, or is it a billion of AI agents, something like that, some crazy promise. Dreamforce, of course, just happened out there in California. So they're still big. Dell Boomi. It's actually not Dell anymore. It's just Boomi. I was part of Dell. Now it's Boomi. So Gemini's throwing the old moniker on there. It's just Boomi. They've spun out on their own. Yours truly went to Boomi World. Steve Lucas is leading that organization today. iPaaS, integration platform as a service. They're focused on AI agents these days. They're focused on building out a registry. And they even mused at their conference, gosh, do we even need these API connectors anymore because of the age of AI agents? Well, we're going to talk about that on future shows. I've talked about that on a past show with some of the folks who built Eidolon. That's August Data. Good friend of mine is involved in that company. And wow, AI agents, it's going to be a very interesting road down the AI agent path. And I would argue that and they can do all kind of stuff. They can do integration, they can do ingest, of course, they can do observation, they can do lots of different things. But how do they coordinate with each other? How do you shepherd them? How do you build guardrails for these AI agents? Remains to be seen. SnapLogic, Gaurav Dhillon founded that company. Of course, he was a founder of Informatica. So he took some of his lessons learned from Informatica and brought it over to SnapLogic. As the name suggests, they were focused really on allowing you to snap together pieces to pull together data pipelines. So they are an intelligent integration platform as a service, iPaaS, kind of similar to Boomi. Fivetran took the world by storm a number of years ago. We did some work with them in, I want to say like the 2017, 2018 timeframe. And now they are just a behemoth. They are huge. They've really mastered the art of automated data pipelines for extracting, loading, and transforming data, ELT versus ETL. Of course, that all happened largely with the cloud. ETL used to be the standard, extract, transform, load, and then it changed to ELT largely because of the cloud, because someone figured out, some clever person figured out that if you extract the data and then just load it into the cloud, you can use the compute power in the cloud to do the transformation. So it's faster that way. You can leverage a lot more compute power typically in the cloud than you can on-prem, or at least it's easier to do so. So that's where ELT came from. It's a very, very popular protocol these days. Another one that came up is Matillion. So I've worked with those guys too. They have a purpose-built platform for cloud data warehouses like Snowflake and Amazon Redshift. And Amazon Redshift, that came from Parexel. I remember working with Barry Zane and Rick Glick over at Parexel years and years ago, and they were building out this analytic engine that got bought by Amazon. And I remember when they when they brokered a deal with Amazon to resell their technology, I thought to myself, well, it sounds a little dangerous because they were trying to sell a very high-priced analytics engine and which they built, and it was very cool, very cutting edge technology. And then they did this partnership with Amazon. And the thing with Amazon is they're always trying to drive down the price. That's in their DNA. So it's good for the customer, not so good for the partner or the vendor. And indeed, Parexel went out of business. They disappeared. They got woven into the Borg, if you will, over at Amazon. And now that is the engine behind Amazon Redshift. Stitch, interesting cloud first platform that offers data pipelines for extracting and loading data into cloud data warehouses. I don't know much about Stitch. I'll have to look at that into them. Airbyte is number 9 on this list, and that, of course, is Michel Tricot. Hevo Data is another one that Gemini says is a no-code data platform, data pipeline platform that offers automated data integration and transformation for various sources and destinations. Well, folks, I mean, there are many more too. So I asked Gemini, give me another 10. You got Clio Integration Cloud, Workato, Celigo, Astera, Jitterbit. SAP, of course, has data integration. DST, Kabula, that's a very interesting company. I interviewed them at a conference last year, one of their founders. Very, very cool user interface for being able to build data pipelines and kind of observe what they're doing. Xplenty is another one. And then, as you heard in my conversation with Michel Tricot of Airbyte, there's also streaming. So, of course, Kafka is a very prominent platform that came out of LinkedIn. Jay Krebs and the folks over there, they just had their conference down in Austin, Texas last week. They are a juggernaut and they've got a lot of momentum behind them. 150,000 companies around the world are using Kafka. What? 150,000. And my friends at that dot are going to piggyback on that world and try to sell their streaming technology, their streaming graph into that world. It's not exactly data integration, but it's still very cool stuff. But my point on streaming is that it's a different way entirely of viewing data, of consuming data, of publishing and subscribing to data feeds. And so streaming is one of these things where if you can re-architect your environment to focus on a streaming first platform, you can forget about a lot of the data integration challenges that you've dealt with over the years. That is a seriously big deal. And I remember the first thing that popped into my mind when I wrapped my head around what these topics are all about and what Kafka is all about is that you publish a topic, let's say customer transactions, and then any number of departments or partners can subscribe to that feed. So all of a sudden now it's a one to many and everyone's getting the same data at the same time. The guys from Citizens Bank we were talking to the other day on a separate show were blowing my mind. They were saying that they were able to shorten the time it takes to populate customer data changes in their systems from multiple days, like 4 or 5 days, down to less than a couple of minutes. Now think about that. Think about how that changes the customer experience. I mean, wow, hello. That's a really good experience to be able to do it that quickly. It's just magic. It's basically what it is. Now you still have to wrangle with the topics and kind of understand where they're going, what they're doing. Being able to share and blend topics, of course, is something of great interest. But the point is, streaming can get data from point A to point B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P. Whatever, anywhere you want it to go, someone can subscribe to that topic and get the data. That is a huge deal. But again, it's a very different view of the world. One of my friends, again, at that dot page, Roberts was telling me that when she was at Vertica, lots of companies were persisting Kafka streams in Vertica to get that historical data. So you want the historical data, and then the stream is the live data, is the active data. Still an amazing way of dealing with things. But folks, what can I say? It's never a dull moment I hear on this show. Thank you so much for listening. Send me an email, info@dmradio.biz if you want to be on the show. We want to know what you want to know. So let me know. And we'll talk to you next time, folks. You've been listening to DM Radio.